This week on Jerusalem Dateline, President Trump visits Israel and pledges to protect it. Plus, a look at a major archaeological discovery in the heart of Jerusalem. And Israelis celebrate the 50th anniversary of the reunification of Jerusalem. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Egyptian Christians suffered yet another horrific terror attack. 26 people died when unidentified gunmen opened fire on a bus carrying Coptic Christians traveling to the St. Samuel Confessor Monastery about 60 miles from the Egyptian city of Minya. 25 others were wounded, some in critical condition. The attack comes after Egyptian President El-Sisi declared a 3-month state of emergency after twin attacks on Palm Sunday last month that killed nearly 50 people. ISIS claimed responsibility for those attacks. Here in Israel, U.S. President Donald Trump paid a historic visit to the Jewish state. As Israel hosted him, the terrorist murder of kids in the U.K. underscored Israel's own security concerns. The Manchester massacre changed the landscape of a carefully crafted series of meetings. It was also a reminder of the Palestinian terror ties in the heart of the Middle East. At his meeting with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas in Bethlehem, the president altered his prepared remarks.
The terrorists and extremists and those who give them aid and comfort must be driven out from our society forever.
Following his strong speech against terrorism in Saudi Arabia, President Trump was fired up over the carnage in Manchester.
This is what I've spent these last few days talking about during my trip overseas. Our society can have no tolerance for this continuation of bloodshed. We cannot stand a moment longer for the slaughter of innocent people. And in today's attack, it was mostly innocent children.
This was clearly not the script Abbas had written for his time in Bethlehem with the president, but it was tailor-made for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has tried to make the West understand that Israel cannot compromise its security on the front lines of the terrorist war, sometimes conducted by Palestinians. Just last week, CBN News reported on the Palestinian practice of paying terrorist salaries with U.S. tax dollars and naming town squares after suicide bombers. Itamar Marcus of Palestinian Media Watch says one such terrorist was Abu Sukkar, known as the refrigerator bomber.
What did he do to make himself famous? He took a refrigerator, brought it to Ben Yehuda Street in the center of Jerusalem, filled it with explosives, and it detonated, killing 15 Israelis. So that makes him a Palestinian hero, and there's a square in his name. Basically, anyone who's killed a large number of Israelis is presented by the Palestinian leadership as a hero to their people.
From Bethlehem, the president moved on to Yad Vashem, Israel's memorial to victims of the ultimate act of mass terrorism, the Holocaust.
2/3 of the Jews in Europe were sent to their deaths. Words can never describe the bottomless depths of that evil or the scope of the anguish and destruction.
A sometimes visibly moved Netanyahu thanked the president on behalf of the Israeli people.
Mr. President, over the years, Israel has had many friends, but Israel has never had and will never have a better friend than the United States of America.
Israelis have experienced firsthand the hatred and terror of radical violence. Israelis are murdered by terrorists wielding knives and bombs. Hamas and Hezbollah launch rockets into Israeli communities where school children have to be trained to hear the sirens and to run to the bomb shelters with fear, but with speed. ISIS targets Jewish neighborhoods, synagogues, and storefronts. And Iran's leaders routinely call for Israel's destruction. Not with Donald J. Trump, believe me.
President Trump has talked about trying to accomplish what so many have failed to do, bring a successful peace deal between Israel and its enemies. CBN News correspondent David Brody brings us that story.
Peace in the Middle East. How many times have we heard that before? But could things be different now that President Trump is on the scene? This peace process has never seen anything quite like him. Before Donald Trump became president, he was known as one of the best deal makers in the entire world. Well, now he's come to Israel hoping for what he calls the ultimate deal, peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It's not going to be an easy task, plenty of stumbling blocks ahead, but one thing is for sure, all roads lead through Jerusalem. It's the ultimate stumbling block in any two-state solution. Both the Palestinians and Israelis see the holy city as their capital. Official U.S. policy considers it disputed territory. But as a candidate, Trump told CBN News he was ready to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
I am for that 100%. We are for that 100%.
As president, however, he dialed that back in our interview in January.
There's certainly a chance of it, absolutely. But we're doing very detailed studies on that, and we'll come out very soon. I hate to do that because that's not usually me, studies.
Right.
It's usually I do what's right. But this has two sides to it. It's not easy.
That's because a provocative move like that might disrupt the peace process before it even gets going. So this trip, with no embassy announcement, definitely disappointed many Israelis and evangelical supporters back in the United States. He did make history, though, becoming the first sitting president to visit the Western Wall. Some see that as a positive signal, although some in the Trump administration won't admit the wall is part of Israel. It's all part of a very sensitive process.
It's not easy. I've heard it's one of the toughest deals of all, but I have a feeling that we're going to get there eventually. I hope.
I do look forward to our discussions, which I think are pregnant with possibilities.
The hope comes from an unlikely customer, Iran. The administration believes Arab nations like Saudi Arabia would be willing to work more closely with Israel and stand together against a common enemy, thus advancing the peace process. Waleed Faris has consulted the president on Mideast peace.
He has the heart to it. He wants to achieve it as something big that no previous president has been able to solve. But realities are realities, not just in our politics here in the United States, but in the Middle East.
The president knows he'll have his hands full getting the Palestinians to the negotiating table. His meeting in Bethlehem with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas was an attempt to see what's possible.
The problem is not between us and the Judaism. It's between us and occupation.
For his part, President Trump is keeping his cards close to the vest. He hasn't signaled yet what that peace process plan will be like exactly, and that's done intentionally. It's part of his deal-making DNA. The question then becomes, will his deal-making and his big personality be enough to push this process over the finish line? David Brody, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Before President Trump came to Israel, he visited Saudi Arabia and delivered a landmark speech in the capital, Riyadh. CBN News' George Thomas spoke with Middle East expert Joel Rosenberg about the impact of that speech and an historic shift in the region.
Joining us for some perspective on the president's recent trip is Middle East expert and author Joel Rosenberg. Joel, good to have you back on the show. How significant was the president's speech on Islam that he gave in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia?
That was an astounding speech. I think it was tremendously successful. It's not that the president said things that he hadn't said before, but he said them in Saudi Arabia. He specifically, he was respectful.
Yeah.
He was respectful, and he was very clear, and this is maybe something he hasn't done so well in the past. He was very clear about the differences between moderate Muslims, the vast majority, and Islamist radicals. But he was clear. He used that term, both Islamist radicalism, Islamic extremism, and he said it in Saudi Arabia, not only to the Saudis themselves, but to leaders of 50 Muslim countries. And it wasn't a controversial statement, nor should it be. But that was really impressive, and it showed American leadership is back in the Middle East. The American superpower is re-engaging, and that couldn't be, there couldn't be something more important than that right now.
You know, obviously saying this in Saudi Arabia, as you know very well, Joel, Saudi Arabia is a chief exporter of Wahhabi Islam around the world. Some would say a chief exporter of Islamic terrorism around the world. Will the Saudis take heed and know that there is a man in the White House who wants to annihilate ISIS, wants to deal with radical Islam, and will they do the things necessary to make those changes within the kingdom?
Yes. Look, I think the Saudis are changing. I do think that. Now, it's an open, the case is not closed yet, but I think if you look carefully, we are not seeing a country, since 9/11 that's really trying to actively encourage terrorism. It's true that Wahhabism has been a huge problem, and they have exported it globally. But I think you're seeing significant changes in the textbooks in Saudi Arabia. You're seeing them actively participate in trying to defeat ISIS, the Islamic State. Clearly, the Saudis are deeply concerned about and want to draw a line and stand against Iranian Shia aggression, both in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the Saudis are proving themselves to be faithful allies. Perfect allies? No. But the president actually said, we're looking for partners, not perfection. Mm-hmm. And I think that was the right tone.
Joel, you mentioned before that Trump's visit shows that America has re-engaged in the region. What do you mean by this?
Well, we've had 8 years of President Obama disrespecting our traditional Sunni Arab allies, wouldn't even invite the Egyptian president El-Sisi to the White House during that time. Yes, President Obama went over and bowed to the Saudis, but then he basically made a deal. He did. He made a deal with the Sunnis' worst enemy, Iran. He disrespected Israel during that process. Yes, he helped fund Israel on military projects, but wouldn't listen to Israeli counsel at all on the Iranian nuclear issue. So here's the bottom line. You have a strategic realignment going on that's historic. That is, the Sunni Arabs and Israel want to work with the United States against two common and existential enemies, Iran and the Islamic State. And President Trump went in and said, that's what I want to work with you on.
The capture of Jerusalem's Temple Mount 50 years ago sent shockwaves throughout the Jewish world. It also raised hopes among some for the building of the Third Temple. On June 7, 1967, Israeli Brigade Commander Moti Gur made an announcement the Jews had waited to hear for some 2,000 years. Retaking this ground was important for a number of reasons. For one, it's where King Solomon built the first Jewish temple. After the Babylonians destroyed it, Zerubbabel laid the foundation stone for a second temple that was later expanded by King Herod. It fell at the hands of the Romans in 70 AD. When Commander Gur declared that the Temple Mount was back in Jewish hands, it rekindled hope for a long-awaited Third Temple.
The Six-Day War was a miracle of biblical proportions and was a cataclysmic opening of a new era for Israel and for the whole world.
Rabbi Chaim Richman of the Temple Institute is dedicated to rebuilding the Jewish temple. He sees the time since the Six-Day War as a prophetic shift.
It would be hard, I think, not to see what's happened in the past 50 years as a tremendous jumpstart, a tremendous fast forward. It's more than prophetic. It's like a kiss from heaven, you know, it's like a divine kiss. It's an intimate brush with the reality of God's compassion and love, and he keeps his promises.
The Institute shares a key connection to the battle for Jerusalem. Its founder, Rabbi Yisrael Ariel, served with the 55th Paratrooper Brigade that captured the Temple Mount. After the victory, a Jordanian guide gave them a remarkable tour.
His job was to carry the company machine gun. There's a very beautiful photograph of that. He actually, the first night of the liberation of Jerusalem, he was given the task of guarding over the spot of the Dome of the Rock, which of course we believe is the Holy of Holies. The story, though, that he told us is that the soldiers were on the Temple Mount, and it was just like the first hour or so. And they were approached by a Jordanian fellow in Western dress who explained that he was the official tour guide for the Jordanian parliament, and he offered to take the soldiers and show them the sights on the Temple Mount. And he takes the soldiers, you know, the rabbi there, and he says, well, this is exactly where the sanctuary stood. This is where the altar stood, and then this is where the menorah stood. It tells him all these things about the history of the Holy Temple. Finally, the rabbi asked him, why are you telling us all this? And he said, well, we have a tradition from our fathers, they from their fathers, that one day the Jews would wage a war and conquer this mountain and rebuild the Holy Temple. And I assume that you're starting tomorrow. And I want this to be my part in helping you.
What was their reaction to that story?
Well, gosh, I guess they were pretty surprised, but the bottom line is, in hindsight, it doesn't look like we were ready.
50 years later, that's changed, with the Temple Institute preparing blueprints and gathering official temple elements, such as the priestly garments. Richmond is also dispelling myths about the temple on today's digital loudspeaker, YouTube.
Let's start at the beginning. What was the Holy Temple really all about?
All of this means talk of rebuilding the temple is no longer considered a fringe idea.
Today, there is a lobby in the Knesset of how many members of Knesset that are constantly speaking about Jewish rights to pray on the Temple Mount. There are members of Knesset that actually talk about the rebuilding of the Holy Temple. Do you understand that 20 years ago, these people wouldn't have been given a moment on prime time television in Israel to say these things? They would have been laughed out.
So, a few years ago, this was considered fringe?
Zealots, lunatics, peculiar. Today it's mainstream.
One of those members is Yehuda Glick.
10 years ago, there was not a single member of Knesset who would send the Temple Mount. Today, we have 20 of the Knesset members who are interested in sending Temple Mount, praying on the Temple Mount, and are part in the battle for the redemption of the Temple Mount and for bringing the Temple Mount back into the center of the next step in the redemption process.
Richmond sees the temple through the eyes of the prophet Isaiah, who wrote 3,000 years ago that God's house would be a house of prayer for all nations.
It means basically that there's a God in the world and that the best is yet to come, and that we are so connected to Him and to each other and to that purpose and to all humanity. And it's just a wonderful privilege to be here with you today, to be looking out over Jerusalem and to realize that we're living in probably the most important time in history. If you believe in the God of Israel and you see His hand on His people and you understand the tremendous changes that have gone on over the years, you see that the one who brought us this far isn't finished and will keep His promises.
Israeli archaeologists announced a major discovery in the ancient city of David. We had the opportunity to see this discovery, and it goes back to the time when Jesus walked its ancient streets, and the Romans later destroyed Jerusalem. Take a look. About 20 feet below the surface, Israeli archaeologists have uncovered a 2,000-year-old road next to the city of David. The road leads from the Pool Siloam below and goes up to the Temple Mount. 2,000 years ago, this likely would have been the route that Jesus took on his way up to the temple.
This is probably where Jesus acted and marched during his time.
Moran Hajbi is an archaeologist with the Israel Antiquities Authority.
We know today that this street was paved during the time of Pontius Pilate, which famous for crucifying Jesus. And now it's opening a new era in the research of Jerusalem.
The excavation points directly to the time the Romans quelled a Jewish rebellion and destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. One example is this remarkably preserved 2,000-year-old burned palm frond or branch.
When we're speaking about the destruction, this is a destruction. The palm tree was burned in the fire that the Roman ignited here. And again, when we're speaking about the last moment of Jerusalem, this tree probably saw the last moment of Jerusalem. And again, it's very symbolic because the palm tree is the symbol of Judea in that time.
They also discovered weapons of war from Jerusalem's fight for life.
This is the evidence of the battle. These ballista balls that was shot by catapults into the city, maybe within the city itself. Arrowheads that was fired both by the Romans and the Jewish rebels. And obviously we're speaking about battles and wars, and we have the weapons here that, again, telling us these stories.
Some escaped through this drainage channel. For Hajbi, the project tells a compelling story.
And the fighting was happening here in the street and in the drainage channel, which is right underneath us. People were just running away through these drainage channels. Some of them ran to Masada. Sometimes I find myself imagine people running along the street, maybe running from the Romans, maybe running to fight against the Romans, and again, and this fire in this background.
Within a few years, as the dig moves toward the Temple Mount, people can look forward to retracing the steps of Jesus from 2,000 years ago. As you heard earlier, many believe the Six-Day War was a miracle of biblical proportions. Here's a look back at the battle over Jerusalem and how some Israelis marked the 50th anniversary of the war and the reunification of the city of Jerusalem. It was an amazing sight to see thousands of Israelis celebrating the reunification of the city of Jerusalem. That's also an example of what you can see on our social media. So please take a look and share us with your family and friends. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube. That's it for this edition. Thanks for joining us. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.